Greetings all, and welcome to the 37th episode of the VTP, or the Veteran Trainer's Perspective. Today we are going to be taking a look at a fundamental look at one of the most important and readily tackled subjects in all of Pokemon, and a feature that has become a staple for the franchise ever since its debut in Generation 2. Today, we are going to be taking a look at Pokemon Genders, and how they function, how they are classified, and what implications the different aspects of the subject have regarding how Pokemon breed and develop both in the wild and in captivity.
To start things off, we must define what we mean by a Pokemon's gender, and thankfully, this is a relatively easy task to do in concept and even in execution. When we speak of a Pokemon's gender in a scientific context, we are specifically referring to the sex of a Pokemon, whether they are male or female in form or something else entirely. This not only refers to how these species have male and female forms, sometimes with anatomical differences that can make each side readily discerned, but also to the fact that, as with many species of life in the world, there are exceptions that can be counted as both sexes or even neither of them, a category that we refer to as having an unknown gender for the sake of conciseness. Most species of Pokemon are able to reproduce sexually with a male and female specimen, typically being required to produce offspring in the form of the lowest evolutionary state of the mother, but this is also where we need to make some distinctions regarding how reproduction happens in the world of Pokemon, as there is more than one way to make offspring in the wild. While it is true that most trainers are used to Pokemon reproducing by creating eggs, the truth is that this is something that mainly occurs in captivity, as sexual reproduction via other methods, like live birth, is also possible, and there are trade-offs to both sides. While it is possible to make many more offspring with processes like live birth, the infants that are often created tend to be weaker at birth than they could be otherwise, with numbers compensating for this. Eggs, on the other hand, limit the number of Pokemon that can be produced, but the offspring can inherit benefits like IV values and even egg moves from parents, so they have a greater chance to survive in the wild in this state. However, for this to even be possible, the parents must also typically share an egg group, so the genes are actually compatible with each other. The one exception to this is Ditto, as it can uniquely breed with most Pokemon because of their flexible genetic structure, but by and large this means that gender is still an important component to understanding how Pokemon can reproduce, and thankfully, it is about as simple as it seems on paper for most cases.
With that said, however, we also need to acknowledge that, while it would be seen as normal for Pokemon in this respect to have an even split in terms of how many males and females are made naturally, this is not the case at all in all situations. And this is where we bring in the main subject of this small report, namely, how we deal with the gender ratios of many species.
This is essentially what it sounds like, the ratio between males and females for a given species, and most Pokemon that can reproduce sexually have an even split between males and females. This makes sense in regards to mammalian Pokemon at the very least, as mammals tend to generate an equal number of offspring for both males and females by design at the level of cellular reproduction, with equal combinations of XX and XY sex chromosome pairs. It is a bit more interesting to see this play out for other types of life forms, though. In fact, this even spread among many other different types of life forms, including those whose gender tends to be influenced by a number of environmental factors like population growth and temperature, tends to help in defining and discerning Pokemon from non-Pokemon life forms in their natural habitats, and it is possible that it might have just been naturally adapted as a way to simplify the breeding process for many of these creatures. However, this is not to say that this is the case with all Pokemon, and it is here that we can investigate further and focus on the three major exceptions to this rule, namely skewed gender ratios, pure genders, and Pokemon whose genders are unknown. First of all, let's take a look at Pokemon that possess what we call a skewed gender ratio, which essentially just means that the ratio between males and females in a species is a ratio that is not 50-50 or 1-to-1 to put it more simply, but nonetheless features Pokemon that can exist as both male and female separately. This might mean that the ratio is skewed a little bit towards one side over the other, or greatly skewed, and this typically occurs with ratios of 1-to-3 or 1-to-7, meaning that some families only have a 25% chance of being one gender and 75% of being the other, or have a 12.5% chance of being one gender and an 87.5% chance of being the other. Between the ratios where males are more plentiful than females and vice versa, there are a lot of possibilities as to why that may be the case, but there are two different major reasons for why this likely occurs in nature, with both at least being similar in that it is mainly a result of environmental and social factors for the most part. In the case where males tend to be more dominant than females, this seems to be the result of males in that species being stronger and more resilient than females, making it more likely that you are going to end up with a stronger and more viable offspring for future generations. This is actually a factor that could even be seen in the original breeding mechanics of Generation 2, as males typically would have better DVs in some departments than females by default, no matter what you did to try and get a better one. This is mainly due to how gender was actually calculated and assigned in that generation. A classic example that can be readily brought in are the members of the Machop family, as the natural biology illustrates the point simply and directly. These creatures are all well known for their impressive muscle mass and incredible physical strength, but because they tend to focus on physical strength as their dominant attribute, fueled by growth hormones and testosterone, males naturally tend to have much more muscle mass than females, which means that evolution is more likely to select males in their case when it comes to making more offspring. This normally isn't an issue for humans as the same phenomenon can be observed with us, but the physical need for more muscle mass is much more of a dominant trait in these species, so the genetics have seemingly changed and adapted to maximize this feature's impact on their gender. On the flip side to this though, there is the issue of why some groups have more females than males naturally, and in this case, it seems that behavior is a more dominant aspect to the situation, as the members of this group tend to have more aggressive males compared to females, and given that many males in this instance might try to fight with each other over mates, having a larger female population can help to counter this by providing not only more females to breed with, but also results in less bloodshed as there would be fewer aggressive males around to cause issues in a given population. Humans have even done this artificially on ranches, showing that selective treatment can lead to a greater female population in some artificial cases. For here, we can actually take the members of the Snubble family as a noteworthy case, as there are many more females in this family produced than males, and that's mainly because the males tend to be much more aggressive at any stage of maturity compared to females. While it doesn't have a huge impact on breeding populations in their instance, it does help to ensure that males aren't so likely to attack each other for breeding access, so the concept seems to work in practice.
Now, let's take a look at cases where the gender ratio is not just skewed, but is non-existent in the sense that a single specimen is either purely male or female, with no gender counterpart for them in any way, shape, or form.
While this might seem to be an extreme to the idea of a skewed gender ratio, in truth these creatures exist in their state for reasons that are purely biological in origin in almost every instance, and in turn are actually much easier to understand as a whole. As far as single-gender species go, there are mainly two factors that can result in their creation, the first of which is sexual dimorphism. In some cases, a Pokémon species might be all one gender because the males and females of a single true species possess such extreme sexual dimorphism that they cannot be considered to truly be the same Pokémon, with major differences not only in their appearances, but also the base stats, moves, abilities, and so on. The best example of this can be seen with Tauros and Miltank. As well, they are both bovines in their general biology and shared species. They are treated as two very different Pokémon as a result of the unique powers and attributes that define them as Pokémon. These two creatures can still breed with one another, thankfully, but it is further noted that there is a weird quirk to their existence. As well, it's easy to get more Miltank from a pairing of these two in captivity. Wild Tauros can actually only be produced reliably in the wild, as eggs will only make more Miltank. Only live birth can create more Tauros, possibly because of factors of aggression and species integrity among males, as seen in species where there's a skewed gender ratio in favor of females without there being a total lack of males. However, there are also cases where there isn't a counterpart between two different types of creatures that might be of only one gender, and in these cases, it is because the creatures in question are hermaphrodites. To understand it simply, these creatures have the capacity to make more of themselves without the need of others of their line or of a different gender, both in the wild and in captivity. Now, for females this makes sense as such creatures exist naturally in the real world, with them often either possessing both male and female haploid cells that can allow them to make a functioning zygote on their own, or otherwise have the capacity to actually combine the genetic material in two egg cells to make new offspring. However, this is generally only possible in pure female species in the real world, so this can explain how Pokemon like Hypini and their evolutions can be made, which makes sense that they can make both unfertilized and fertilized eggs with little trouble. What if Pokemon that are of the opposite case? What can be said about the all-male species like the members of the Tyrogue family? Well, while it is incredibly rare in the real world, where the creatures considered to be male to female, contrary to popular belief, is not actually entirely dependent on the state of their sex chromosomes. When we normally think of males and females being defined as having XY and XX pairs of sex chromosomes, in truth, these chromosomes are not the be-all end-all for determining gender. They are merely a part of the equation. It is the sum of the whole in this instance, namely how the genes are expressed in the rest of the chromosomes, that mostly contributes to this. So even if the sex chromosomes might not be XY as we define them traditionally, it is still possible for the right expression of genes to create a male-only species that can still reproduce with other males to make more of their own kind. The Pokemon that tend to follow this trend are also mainly fighting types that are found in captivity more often than not, so it is possible this transformation might have been heavily influenced by selective breeding by humans, and the members of the Tyrogue family, along with Throw and Sock, make perfect sense as examples to go by. This demonstrates that Pokemon breeding is a much more complex process than most might think offhand, and thus a strange science with great implications for how the human race itself may progress on the topic into the future.
And lastly, in our discussion of gender in Pokemon, we must address Pokemon that are considered to have a gender that is either undefined or otherwise unknown.
It needs to be stated right off the bat, however, that this does not mean they're actually genderless, as we will get into that shortly. It means that their gender is impossible to really determine in any way given current scientific methods of study. In other words, they might have a gender in some sense, but there is no scientific method currently available that can make that distinction. This group is mainly divided into entities that are either artificial or biomechanical in their forms, have genders that must exist as they have the capacity to make more of their kind in the wild, or have genders that are hard to discern because we do not understand if they can even produce offspring in any way. Those that are considered to be artificial or otherwise biomechanical, such as the case of the Staryu and Beldum families, have unknown genders simply because their reproduction habits do not require specific members of any gender in order to actually create more of themselves, and in many cases, the method by which they create more of their kind is not entirely understood or easily explained at the very least. Well, this means that they can't acquire egg moves as a result of this, as they typically need to be bonded with a Ditto in order to create more of themselves in captivity. It tends to do them a lot of favors in the wild, since it can simplify the reproduction process for them, allowing them to focus their energies into different processes and thus make better use of their natural powers. The members of the Voltorb and Magnemite families are great examples of this, as they can build themselves out of almost any material, as the forms are usually pretty easy to replicate, and they have the blueprints for their own forms embedded into their minds. Second, there are creatures that we are sure have the capacity to create more of themselves, but whose reproduction processes are totally unknown to science for the most part, despite them being biological in origin. This mainly comes in the form of legendary Pokemon that are animalistic in some definable state, and that tend to exist in multiples in the wild, like the members of the legendary Bird Trio, as well as creatures like Lugia and Ho-Oh. It is interesting to note that this second category is actually the newest of the three, as it has only been observed in modern times that, as a prime example, Lugia can in fact create chicks of themselves, the infants resembling the parents quite strongly. Not surprisingly, these creatures are highly protective of their offspring and will not let anyone near them, so it has been all but impossible to learn more than this, but at least gives an indication these creatures have the capacity to make natural offspring. The last of these are the ones that most think of when they look at Pokemon that have no assignable gender, as they are the creatures that, despite having organic forms, do not have the capacity to seemingly create any offspring of any sort. This includes a lot of deity-class legendaries, the monsters that represent the powers and nature of the natural world, or even those that come to us from afar, such as Deoxys. In all of these cases, this may honestly just be down to the fact that we don't know what really classifies as gender for them, and how that makes a difference in their lives, if at all, which is also why we classify them as having an unknown gender and not genderless. Science can only progress so much as it is, so we cannot make a definitive claim on the reproductive attributes when we might just not have a way to properly classify them. As such, beasts of all sorts that fall under this category are still under great research, and given that it has been known that Arceus can potentially create others like the members of the Creation Trio, it may only be a matter of time before a better definition for these beasts is created and defined. As it can be seen here, despite its seemingly simple classification, gender is not an easy attribute to define and assign as a result of a myriad array of attributes that affect the rates which Pokemon of different genders occur, and this requires a better understanding of said factors in order to make it possible to more easily define them. Even so, it is still imperative that trainers take the time to understand the concept more in depth if they have plans to eventually become Pokemon breeders, or if they're just doing their best to make the most of their time in hatching eggs for specific Pokemon. So if you want to really get into understanding the mechanics of breeding, understanding how gender works is the first big step, and the one that will be needed if one really wishes to make the most of their time in the breeding practice.
That's it for now, so thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you all in the next episode of the VTP. Thank you all for watching this video. It always brings me great joy to see others enjoying the work I do to try and make the world of Pokemon and the fascinating creatures that lay inside of it feel as real as they possibly can. If you really enjoy my work, please feel free to leave a comment and subscribe, as I always do my best to respond to any and all comments that are left on my videos. In addition, if you wish to learn more about my work and help support it, you can find links to my Patreon page, as well as email and other contact information to my work on DeviantArt in the video description down below. Furthermore, you can find a link to my Discord server there as well if you'd like to get a first glimpse at what videos are coming up next and converse with other fans of the world of Pokemon. Thank you for taking the time to watch this, and have a wonderful rest of your day.